Hey guys, so this is going to be a very different video than usual. So a few weeks ago, Synology reached out to me and asked me if I had any plans for World Backup Day. At the same time, a friend of mine that I've known forever reached out to me because he unfortunately lost some of his data on an external hard drive and just wanted to pick my brain to try and figure out what he can do to ensure that that never happens again. So I figured that for World Backup Day, this might actually be the perfect opportunity to kind of showcase somebody that lost some data and at the same time configure a system to ensure that he never loses data again. So to summarize, he owns his own media company and he is a complete beginner.
Quick question, isn't it a USP device?
No, UPS.
Okay, all right, cool. I want to make sure.
He didn't even know what a NAS was as soon as I started to explain it to him. So it's the perfect video for beginners because a lot of the questions that he had are probably things other beginners would be interested in learning about as well. So in this video, we're going to go through some of the problems that he faced to ultimately get to the point that he's at now, which is trying to come up with a solution to ensure that this never happens again. Then we'll go through the setup process of a Synology NAS, which for transparency purposes, I reached out to Synology and asked them if they'd be interested in providing a DS923 Plus for this, and they did. So that's what we'll be configuring for this. So thank you very much to Synology for that. And after we look at that, we're just gonna go through some of the questions that he has now that he has this new device and he generally has no idea how it works. So I cut out a pretty large piece of this where Nick was basically just thanking Synology for sending him the device and thanking me for some of the support that I provided for him. But didn't think you guys needed to see that, but as you go through this, Nick has been using this for a few weeks at this point, and overall, he said it's already helped him out tremendously, so we are going to jump right into it. All right, so talk to me about some of the problems that you've been facing.
Man, where do I start? It's like the hard drives are a big problem because even though they're 2 or 4 or even 8 terabytes, you know, they do get filled up pretty quick. You know, our files are pretty large. So whenever we're shooting videos and, you know, we have an editor in New York or California, you need to figure out a way to get them the file. And using something like Dropbox or Google Drive, it doesn't do the job the right way because the files get compressed, you know, and when you're sending in a 100 gigabyte file, they tell you that it's not compressed, but all you need to do is look at the file size and you're like, clearly it's compressed, you know?
Yeah.
So it's a big problem. So what we've resorted to was mailing hard drives back and forth. Not
That's pretty crazy.
Not a good thing to do.
No, not ideal.
And then also with the instance, I know you know, but in one case, in one scenario, the files got corrupted, you know, on the hard drive. Not a good thing. And kind of need access to the files.
So when you are normally working on these files, do you edit them directly off the external hard drive or SSD, whatever it is, or do you copy them to your computer? What do you do?
I've done both. Copying to the computer doesn't work that well because files get large very quick. If you're using a 1 terabyte, 2 terabyte computer, and you have other stuff on the computer, 1 terabyte, I mean, I've done it before. 1 terabyte literally didn't even work. Like I couldn't do it. So
man, you're working with much larger files than mine. That's pretty crazy how large they are.
Yeah. Thank Canon, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, man, the files are large, and dude, when we're shooting in RAW, oh my gosh. You know, 15 minutes is 300 gigs, you know?
Okay. So from that perspective, obviously it sounds like you need more storage space, you need more reliable storage space, and then you need a way to share files. Do you need to share the full size file, or would you be able to use like a proxy and only send that? How exactly, like what in a perfect case would you do?
Perfect case would be to send the full size file.
So what we're going to do to solve all of this is that Synology hooked you up with a DS923 Plus. And in essence, the DS923 Plus is network attached storage. So you're used to working off of a hard drive those days are going to be gone. You're going to be working off of the NAS. And how you work off the NAS is going to be totally dependent on you. But you have two options. You can either edit directly off the NAS, or you can just copy the file locally. And then from that point, you edit locally, you move the data back, etc. So in order to speed that process up, we're going to be adding a 10 gigabit PCIe card to the NAS. And then you bought a 10 gigabit Thunderbolt adapter that you're going to be using, and you're going to be connecting directly to the NAS over 10 gigabit speeds. And in order to ensure that you're going to get 10 gigabit speeds, we are going to be implementing something called SSD caching. So we're going to talk about that later. But the idea behind this is that your data is going to be protected. When you're working on it, there's going to be snapshots, so you'll have data protection there. You're going to have RAID, so you'll have data protection there. You're going to have backups. You're going to have data protection there. You're never going to lose the file again. That's not going to happen. I know that was a lot of information. Do you have anything before we kind of get into the configuration?
No, that sounds great. Let's do it.
Okay, so based on the problems that you shared earlier, I went in and I configured the NAS following some best practices. So the first thing we're quickly going to talk through is the storage manager. So I configured a storage pool using Synology Hybrid RAID. Ultimately, what that means is that you can use mixed size drives. So you have two 4 terabyte drives in there right now. If you want to go in at a later time and add 2 more larger size drives, you can do that and you'll be able to utilize some of the storage space. With traditional RAID, you would not. Not super important for you to know, just understand that your storage pool is set up with flexibility in mind. Next, I configured SSD cache. So you have a 10 gigabit PCIe adapter installed in the DS923 Plus right now. The goal is to be able to get increased speeds. So you might not be able to fully saturate a 10 gigabit connection all the time, but the goal is that you'll be able to max it out as much as you possibly can. So SSD cache is configured in a read-write format using RAID 1. So because read-write cache can at times lead to corruption, Synology enforces RAID 1 to ensure that both drives are configured as a mirror. And if one drive has a problem, the other hopefully won't, and you won't run into any data corruption issues. But if you do run into data corruption issues, we'll talk about later some of the practices that we put in place to ensure that you'll be able to recover from that. The only other thing to talk through is data scrubbing. So I configured data scrubbing to run on a quarterly basis. Not super important for you to understand how it works. The only thing I'll mention is that data scrubbing is designed to heal data if it ever has any problems. So if there's ever any silent corruption that you're not aware of, data scrubbing will go through, check the file. If there is any of that data corruption, it will go through and automatically fix that without you having to do anything. So you'll see this running on a quarterly basis, but overall, it won't really impact anything on your side. You'll just see it running. So that is the protection that we put in place to ensure that if you ever lose a drive, you will not actually lose any of your data. So the next thing that we put into place is something called snapshots. So based on the shared folder name that you gave me, I went in and I created a shared folder. And what I did is I configured this to run on a daily basis at midnight, and you're going to retain 30 total snapshots. So what this means is that if for whatever reason you were to go in and lose data right now, you could roll back to the file from yesterday at midnight or today at midnight, whatever it is, and you'd be able to restore that file. So snapshots freeze data at a point in time. They're great for data protection. You want to do this for all of your shared folders, but since we only created one, it's only set up for that one. So the only thing I'll mention is that since you said earlier that you are working with large video files, it might benefit you to go in and create a separate shared folder for only your video edits. And then what you could do is on that shared folder, rather than running the snapshots daily, you can run them every 15 minutes or every 5 minutes, however frequent you'd want, and then you can increase the retention. So the goal with snapshots are just to be able to restore the data if it ever has any problems. So I put in some additional checks that we'll talk about in a minute here, but snapshots are super important from a data integrity perspective. So we now have 2 layers of data integrity protection. The first is RAID. The second is snapshots. Now, the next thing you talked about is wanting to replace Dropbox or Google Drive, whatever you were using. So in order to do that, what I did is I configured Synology Drive. So Synology Drive is a private cloud. So rather than connecting to a web service, what you'll be doing is connecting directly to your NAS wherever you are. So you mentioned that you had a few different editors that you work with or people that you work with. This is the Synology Drive web console. So when you set up a user account for them, they'll be able to log into this web console and see these files. Now, right now, this TMT shared folder, if you wanted them to be able to access that, the only thing you'd have to do is ensure that they have access to it, which we'll talk about in a second here. But the point is, this is a directory that they can work out of. So overall, this is where you guys are all going to be working inside of, uploading your files, doing everything that you have to do. And then the way that you can control access is actually on the NAS side. So let's assume that you had shared folders that you did not want them to access. You would go in and create a user account for them. And then under their permissions, you would explicitly deny them permission. So they'll have access to one, what you shared with them inside of Synology Drive, and two, what they have access to, meaning what they have permission to. Inside of the Synology Drive Admin Center, I set it up as a team folder. And the important thing to understand here is if you were to go in, set up a team folder, and on their user account, give them access to that shared folder, they would see it inside of this team folder section here. So you can have multiple team folders if you want, and that kind of coincides with what we talked about earlier. If you're working on video edit files and you have more snapshots scheduled, you can set up multiple shared folders, but they'll be able to see all those shared folders on their side as well. Now, the final layer of protection that we implemented is versions inside of Synology Drive. So what you'll see here is we have 32 total versions. So every single time you save a file, what it will do is it will create a version. And at that point, if you needed to, you could go back to one version prior. So for my personal video edits, there have been countless times where the file corrupted or something corrupted with that video edit. All I did is go back one version, restore, and within a few minutes of the process running, and it was really me going through the process, I was exactly back to where I was like a minute prior to that. So I never really lost any data. There were times I ran into corruption, but I never actually lost data. So now, this is the third layer of protection we have in place. This is going to be the first thing you restore. So we talked about snapshots earlier, but this is going to be the first thing you restore. The only thing that's important to understand here is that you're only going to have these versions in files and folders that are on Synology Drive where you're using Synology Drive. If you're not using Synology Drive and you just upload a file directly to the folder, it's not necessarily going to have the same versioning. So that's something to be aware of, something that probably right now doesn't make that much sense. But as you start to use this, it will make more sense. Okay, so with user accounts in mind, what I did is I created two user accounts for you, Nick Admin and Nick. Nick Admin is what you're going to use to access Synology DSM. Now, to be clear, Nick Admin will work for everything because it has access to everything. But from a security best practices standpoint, you're better off using your Nick account. So the Nick account will have access to all the shared folders that you're going to need to access, but it's not going to have access to DSM. DSM is the NAS's operating system. It will not have access to that. So that's generally a best practice to follow. Now, with that in mind, as you can see, I have an admin account here that we will disable as well. But with that in mind, in the security section here, I would suggest that for each account, for all the users that will be accessing your NAS, you enable two-factor authentication. I did not enable it right now, but this is something I'd recommend that you enable, at least for the administrators. It's a best practice to enable it for everybody, but at minimum, the administrators. What that will force is, since we are enabling remote access, if for whatever reason somebody was to sign in with your admin account and get into Synology DSM, there would be a second factor there where they have to have that factor. Since this is your data, it's very, very important to set this up at minimum for your admin account. So this is a way that you can set it up globally, but I'd suggest you set it up for your users as well. That is up to you. For administrators though, I'd say you have to set it up. So that's something that I did not enable, but that's something that you should configure at a later time. Okay, so next, what I set up. What we did is we just set it up as a direct connection. So I came in here for the third network interface. I configured it as a static IP address. And then at that point on your Mac device, which you're currently using to connect to this, you set up a static IP address as well on the same subnet. I know that that doesn't make any sense to you, but ultimately what that means is that your PC will be able to access the NAS and you'll get full 10 gigabit speeds. Now, again, like we talked about earlier, depending on the types of files you're using and how much read-write cache is going to be used in that workflow, you're going to potentially get full 10 gigabit speeds, you're going to potentially get half, etc. The important thing to realize is that you're getting the maximum overall performance that you're able to get. So that is how that's currently configured, not necessarily how you'd configure it if you did have a 10 gigabit switch, but for now, it's going to work. It's going to work well. Now, with all of that in mind, we talked about how data integrity and protection is important. And for World Backup Day, it is of the utmost importance to ensure that everybody has some form of a backup configured. In a perfect world, it will be a 3-2-1 backup. So 3 copies of your data on at least 2 storage mediums with 1 offsite. This is your offsite backup. So the goal behind all of this is to ensure that stuff is done automatically for you. You ever have a problem, you ever lose your data, the backup ran last night, you could go back to that backup and restore it. So I configured it with Synology C2 because I think for you, it would be the easiest place to manage it. There are multiple different storage locations and cloud providers that you can use. However, for right now, I just set it up with Synology C2, but you could see how many options there are here. Inside of here, what this is going to do is it's going to back up just about the entire NAS right now and all the shared folders. With this in mind, this is running on a daily basis. And the entire goal behind this is to ensure that if you ever have a problem, you can restore from yesterday's version. So there are 2 things that are running. The first is the backup. The second is the backup integrity check. So the important thing to understand is that a backup is only as valuable as the restore. If you can't restore the data, the backup is worthless. What this backup integrity check does is it goes through on a weekly basis and ensures that you can restore the data. If you were not running this, when you had to run it, you might not be fully confident that it's going to be able to be restored. With this, you don't have to worry about it. Just about everything in this entire workflow is fully automated. This is automated as well. Now, the Backup Explorer is how you would go through and kind of go through those versions. So you'd be able to navigate through prior versions and see what existed at the time. If you had data, stuff would exist here. But the important thing to understand is that you have the copy locally, and now you'll have the copy in the cloud as well. And that corruption that you talked about earlier with snapshots and versions and now cloud backups, that will never occur again. So ensure that the data is written to the NAS, and then just about everything else will happen in the background without you having to do anything. The final thing that we still have to implement, and it's just because of your location of the NAS right now, would be the UPS device that we talked about earlier. We're just going to enable UPS support, and that will ensure that if you ever lose power, the NAS doesn't lose power. But if you do lose power for an extended period of time and the NAS is on that battery backup, if the battery backup is running out of power, the NAS will safely shut down. That's the last thing we have to do. I haven't done that, but when that's set up and configured, we will come in here and enable it. Just about everything else from a NAS perspective right now is fully configured for you to start using. You could start syncing files with Synology Drive if you wanted to. You could share files with your external users if you needed to. You just have to make sure that you go in and create their user account. So the last thing we're going to talk about is external access. So like we talked about earlier, you could set up a VPN, and a VPN would be more secure. But the goal right now is just ensuring that these editors can get the files. So we're going to use Quick Connect. Synology Quick Connect is, in essence, going to allow you to access this NAS from wherever you are in the world without doing any port forwarding or VPN configuration or anything like that. So we're using Synology Quick Connect. The important thing to mention here is that this is not the only way to do it. It might not even necessarily be the best way to do it. There are various ways that you could do this, but for now, this is what we're going to use. And this is going to allow those external editors to connect directly to this NAS, download the files that they need to, use them, upload the files, etc. So that is the way that they will externally access everything. But overall, it's all configured in a very basic but best practice way that will ensure that some of the problems that you experienced, you'll never run into again. Okay, so I know we just went through a lot. I'm going to open this up to you. What questions do you have? What can I clarify? Is there anything that you want to do on the NAS that you didn't see? We'll go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that was a ton of info. Gonna have to replay that back in my head a couple times, but
just watch the video. Like,
there you go. That's exactly what I'm gonna do. How do I add the editors onto the network?
So inside of the control panel, in the user and group section, you can go in and create a user account. So in here, you just give them a user ID, you enter a password here. So I just created a test user account here. And at this point, like I said earlier, they're only going to be added to the users group. And that will ensure that if you ever go in and add any other files that you don't want them to have access to, they're not an administrator that can administer the entire system. But inside of here, this is the important part. So shared folders can have permission either on a user or a group level. In this specific instance, it's probably easier for you to manage permissions on a user level since you're not going to have that many users come in here and ensure that they do have read-write permission to what they need or they do not have read-write permission. But at the same time, if you did want to manage it at a group level, inside of the group section here, you'll see the users. And then you can come in here and determine exactly what that group has access to. So a better way of probably doing it, if all of these users need to have permission to the same things, would be to come in here and create a new group. So you'd have like a video editors group. And then as soon as you do that, you could come in here, add the users that should have access to it, and then give them the exact permissions. So then you can go in, give them access to the applications they'll need, deny everything else. So let's say you wanted to use Synology Drive, you deny everything else. And then when you got to the user's creation portion of a new user account, you would just add them to the video editors group. And then at that point, they would have the same exact permissions that that group has. So it's just a way for you to individually kind of manage the users, but manage them on a group level. So if you ever had to add a new shared folder for them, you're not going in and adding it to every single one of the users. You're just going into that group, adding it to the group, and then they'll automatically get permission to that.
It's really cool. So if they were to upload, let's just say, the project file along with the export, as well as all of the, let's just say, the audio assets that they have used in the project file, how would they go about doing that?
So the easiest way, in my opinion, is Synology Drive. So they would log into Synology Drive. There are Synology Drive mobile applications. There's a website. There's various ways that you can access it. But they would upload the files for Synology Drive, and they would be uploading it directly to a shared folder. So I know that term shared folder is coming up a lot. In Synology DSM, you create a shared folder.
Yep.
And that shared folder can be accessed various ways. So when you access it through your Mac, for example, you might access it through Finder. And when you access it through Finder, you're actually accessing it through SMB, which to you, you don't have to know, but that's the technology that it's using. Synology Drive is an application. It's designed to be a private cloud. So you can access the files through Synology Drive. They can access the files through Synology Drive. The point is that how you access it and how they access it doesn't necessarily have to be the same. So how they access it, in my opinion, the best way to do it would be using Synology Drive, because then at that point, they're going to get the versions that we talked about earlier. And you're going to have, every time they copy over or save over a file, you're going to have the prior version to it. And it's just a better way of handling it, because in an ideal world, it's going to be very similar to how you're currently working if you're using Dropbox or whatever you're using. So Synology Drive is how I would recommend that they access the files.
Well, I mean, you got all my questions answered, so.
But thank you very much to Synology. It was awesome that they sent Nick out that device, and it was great working with Nick and just kind of configuring the device, following some best practices and ensuring that his workflow is better than it was. But I hope you guys got some value out of this. If you have any questions or feedback or things you think either I could do or Nick could do, love to hear them in the comments. But if you made it this far, thank you very much for watching. I will see you guys next time.